there are silences more mysterious than others. The silence of space is perhaps the most striking of all. Many of us would like to see it broken by an alien civilization speaking up to tell us. What could be translated as "you are not alone." And yet, you've noticed, we hear nothing. Or rather, we are the only ones speaking in the vastness of space, which raises immense questions. Because this great radio silence could well be a hollow scream of warning. Don't leave, you'll see. It's as relentless as it is fascinating. On one hand, no extraterrestrial civilization has been detected. And on the other hand, we have their presumed number. And then the elapsed time, the age of the universe. Let's start with the number. Today, we know of nearly 5,000 exoplanets, that is, planets orbiting stars other than our own. But this number only takes into account those that are close enough or massive enough to be detected by our telescopes. It is believed that there are between 200 and 400 billion stars in our galaxy alone. And considering that only 10% of these stars are stable enough to host a retinue of planets around them, including at least one similar to Earth and located in the habitable zone, that still makes 20 billion potentially hospitable star systems. And even considering that only 1% of these planets see life develop on their surface during their existence, that still makes 200 million hypothetically inhabited planets. And even if intelligent life only appears on 1/2000th of these planets hosting life, then we should end up with a few 100,000 intelligent extraterrestrial civilizations there, now, in our single galaxy. 100,000, a monstrous number, which makes many scientists say that logically, aliens should at least have already manifested themselves, be detectable in the sky, or even have visited us for a very, very long time, if we take into account the time factor. These fascinating ideas will linger in your mind for some time. Let's unfold the reasoning. 4.6 billion years, that's the age of our sun. And you would agree with me that our star is old, but also relatively young compared to the canonical age of our galaxy and many of the stars it contains, which can be 2 to 3 times older than our sun, just like the planets orbiting them, which formed at the same time. Which makes this great silence even more disturbing. Because if intelligent life forms have appeared on the surface of much older worlds, and they have followed development patterns similar to ours, then this should, in theory, mean the presence up there of civilizations much, much more advanced than us, simply because of the additional time they have had to develop since their appearance. To illustrate the potential technological gap between us and hypothetical alien civilizations, let's play a game. And let's take the example of a planet 10 that would have formed, say, 2 billion years before the appearance of our sun, and would then, more or less, have had the same history on its surface as ours. Now, let's make the total duration of existence of the 2 planets equal. And here is represented the additional duration of existence that a civilization that appeared on this planet 10 after as much time as we took to appear on Earth could have over us. Consider that the length of this small strip represents 150 million years, which is the total duration of the reign of the dinosaurs on our planet. This 66 million year period spans from the extinction of the dinosaurs to the present day. This one, 7 million years long, is the duration that separates us from the appearance of the very first hominids. As for this last one, 300,000 years long, it is visually almost reduced to nothing at this scale. The domestication of fire occurred 300,000 years ago. When we think that in the last 70 years, which is barely a few pixels on this timeline, we have discovered particle physics, walked on the moon, and sent probes to the edges of our solar system, it gives us chills to imagine what we could accomplish in just a few more centuries or millennia. Now, think back to the fact that there are billions of planets that have billions of years more existence than us. In the case of our hypothetical planet 10 harboring life, these 2 billion years of additional experience, which on paper could allow to reach degrees of technological development surpassing our wildest dreams. Shouldn't advanced civilizations as old as these have mastered the energy of the stars, like interstellar travel, and have spread into space, or at the very least be visible and detectable due to their intense activity. A simple radio wave, a visual trace of ship acceleration, would that be too much to ask? And yet, despite all this head start, it's the big silence. Listen carefully, we hear nothing. So what happened? How to explain that the number and time is not one? In other words, where are they all? Why does no one speak and nothing is said? This is what we call the Fermi paradox. We have already discussed in a previous episode one of the most terrifying hypotheses to explain this great silence. But the one we are going to detail now is known as the Great Filter. And in my opinion, it is by far the most frightening, because it directly affects the question of our near future, of what awaits us. And this bundle of solutions to explain the silence of extraterrestrials should, I'm sorry, haunt you throughout your life and come back to you every time you look up at the sky and think about the future of humanity. What this Great Filter hypothesis tells us is that, in fact, there is no paradox, no contradiction. If no one has yet detected the presence of other advanced civilizations, even though they should have had plenty of time to spread throughout our galaxy, it's simply because there are no longer any extraterrestrials capable of communicating. Let's return. There are 100,000 worlds that, at some point, saw the emergence of intelligent civilizations. And on the other hand, this relentless observation. Looking up at the sky, these radio silences, 0 extraterrestrials to observe. The Great Filter hypothesis offers a single serious explanation for this strangeness. Something extremely powerful must have happened. Something capable of preventing the emergence of intelligent life, or capable of eradicating all species, able to build spaceships and send signals into the cosmos. And these terrible events to overcome have been, or will sooner or later be, intimately linked to our own destiny. To begin with, let's try to represent in our timeline the great adventure of life on Earth in the form of a long thread that would start in a distant past, pass through our present, and hopefully go on to conquer the stars. We are, just like all other living species currently on our planet, here at the very end of the thread. This is our present. Now, imagine the fate of life forms evolving on the surface of other planets and whose thread of their history would have been abruptly cut off by dramatic events preventing any progression towards the possibility of launching or communicating towards the stars. Well, that's the hypothesis of the Great Filter. These traits, these guillotines coming to mow down in their momentum, the other extraterrestrial living beings in their rising complexity. Complexity can be seen as terrible obstacles that life has, during its history, to face before hoping to reach the stage from which it can claim to reach for the stars. These filters are as many abysses or ditches too wide or too deep to be crossed before being able to say something in the direction of the cosmos. And the nature of these bottlenecks cutting short any progression, or at least through which life seems to struggle to get through, can be extremely varied and can be located in the future as well as in very distant pasts. Indeed, when we look at the history of life on Earth, we can identify many crucial steps necessary to go from primitive living being to one endowed with complex reasons. And many of these steps are candidates for the title of great filters and present meshes of nets that seem very tight, as if during the process of evolution of life, there were one or more barriers, kinds of borders practically impossible to cross, which would prevent life from advancing towards complexity. On Earth, for example, it took nearly 1.8 billion years of evolution for life to invent from simple structures without nuclei more complex cells that have them. 1.8 billion years to go from the stage of a world populated with archaea and bacteria to one that can host plants and animals. We can thus imagine that the increase in complexity of life is, in the cosmos, an extremely rare phenomenon, in which case there may be up there millions of worlds on the surface of which swarm primitive forms of life that, after billions of years of trial and error, have remained more or less at the same stage of complexity. In that case, if we hear nothing, it's simply because no bacteria, even with billions of years of evolution ahead of it, is capable of building a radio telescope. Perhaps even the most difficult obstacles to overcome are just before the start, from the moment when the story begins, and the widest and most difficult obstacle to overcome would be the chance to participate in the race, that is, the appearance of life itself. When you think about it, What were the chances that inert matter would start to organize, replicate, and animate itself? We've been trying to unravel this great mystery for decades, and no one has yet managed to create life from nothing, or more precisely, from the conditions present on Earth at its beginnings. We have absolutely no idea how simple self-replicating molecules managed to structure themselves to set in motion small living organisms. Thus, it is quite possible that this event, the transition from the inert to the living, has a near zero probability of occurrence. And this, even if there is a quantity of worlds with the most favorable conditions. In fact, if this were the case, almost all of the threads wouldn't even exist. And life, even in its most primitive forms, would thus remain desperately absent from the surface of these billions of worlds. Bacteria don't talk. The absence of bacteria even less so. Not only is there no intelligent life elsewhere, but perhaps no other forms of life at all. Moreover, on this point, it is astonishing to think that if the living beings currently on Earth are the only ones not to have crashed during this long obstacle course, then this chance to celebrate also comes with an immense weight on our shoulders. A weight that is not measured in kilos, but in a truly astronomical responsibility, in the sense that if we are truly alone, our actions on Earth have not only a considerable influence on the living beings of a world inhabited among billions of others, but perhaps on those of the only planet harboring complex life in our galaxy, and perhaps even in the entire universe. The responsibility. We have also been able to identify, from the only history we know, that of our planet, other potential candidates capable of abruptly stopping the rise in complexity of life and who can claim the title of major bottlenecks. Let's mention, for example, the terrible gap of the invention of sexual reproduction, or that of the structuring of the brain, and of certain steps identified as necessary for the emergence of complex logical deduction abilities and abstractions. The emergence of complex life forms could be an event of distressing banality, but it is entirely possible that that of intelligence is absolutely not. Just like the emergence of a brain gifted for inventing, making tools. Consider that on our planet, octopuses, dolphins, or chimpanzees also had millions of years to build radio telescopes. And yet, none of these species have done so. In short, you get the idea. And whether the obstacle was unique and cut short any rise in complexity, or whether there were many of them in the form of sieves with wider meshes, in the end, the result is there. Listen carefully. We hear nothing. And so, if today we seem so alone in speaking, it's because the millions of other forms of life that have appeared over time on other planets have never reached the stage of intelligent species. And the strangest thing about all this, maybe if this solitude is confirmed, then this great silence, as frustrating as it may be, comes with a comfort. Because if we are truly alone as a species, then the worst is probably already past. In other words, if it turns out that the big filter or filters are behind us, then strangely, it's actually very, very good news. We would be extremely rare by then, and also very lucky to be part of those who survived, to the point of being able to communicate towards the stars. But on the contrary, if the great filter has not yet been reached, then that's worrying. Because if over time, life evolves elsewhere often and regularly until it reaches the stage we are at, if the increase in complexity of living beings, capable of communicating towards the stars, is a very common phenomenon, then this great stellar silence is the sound of a huge cemetery. If we hear nothing, it's because it's impossible for civilizations with a degree of development like ours to continue to progress, or even simply to maintain themselves over time. In other words, wait. The future looks turbulent, it's going to shake things up severely. Because the great filter is in front of you and still needs to be passed. And since no civilization has apparently managed to overcome this obstacle, that all have been quickly prevented from communicating towards the cosmos, there is no real reason to think that we will fare better than the others. And we are going to have to shut it down soon in our turn. The others are not mute or non-existent, but all are already dead. It is important to understand that here, we are not only talking about technological obstacles, such as an inability to master interstellar travel, or a lack of resources preventing large-scale space colonization, but indeed insoluble problems going as far as forcing to shut it down. Thus, it is quite possible that in the past, thousands of other civilizations have one day reached a degree of development similar to ours, but all have ended up stalling. Consider that with a growth rate of 2% per year, all the easily accessible raw materials on our planet should be exhausted in a few hundred years, at most. A blink of an eye on the scale of cosmic time. And in doing so, unless we stick to rigorous planning and calculated rationing of available resources from the start, it might be impossible to sustain for a sufficient duration. Each advanced civilization inevitably ends up technologically regressing more or less quickly, buckling under the very weight of the physical limits of its environment, an inevitable return to the stage of windmills. Thus, if we hear nothing, it's because in the past, and for each advanced civilization, there have been obstacles of terrible abysses beyond which none of them have recovered. And once again, we're not talking about small areas of turbulence, momentary jolts of history that, taking the form of social collapses, wars, or repeated ecological disasters, would slow down or regress a civilization. A civilization that, after kneeling for several thousand years, could recover and rise again. But rather, something bigger, larger, more consequential dramatic events capable of stopping us dead and permanently in our tracks. What the Great Silence tells us is that no civilization has recovered. Whatever the nature of these obstacles, they have presumably never been able to be overcome. But what kind of disaster could be capable of annihilating or, at the very least, drastically and permanently reducing the potential for intelligent life to develop? Well, here too, the nature of the abyss or abysses to be crossed can be extremely varied. Among the most serious candidates, we find a jumble of generalized environmental disasters, climate runaways caused by the deleterious vices of the lifestyle of the supposedly intelligent species, nuclear wars on a planetary scale, asteroid impacts. But also a number of uncontrolled discoveries or innovations, such as the total takeover of the digital world by artificial intelligence, uncontrolled high-energy physics experiments, or genetically modified superviruses or bacteria. In short, we're not going to list them all, there are many others anyway. The thing to remember here is that almost all of these reasons that could potentially lead a civilization to the brink of extinction involve events that can only occur with a certain degree of technical development. As if every civilization with too much power inevitably proves incapable of managing it. As if all supposedly intelligent species always prove too stupid to master their own toys. So, if it's the rise of radio silence, it's because every time a civilization begins to gain power, shortly after the appearance of radio or space flights, it gets carried away and ends up imploding in flight, like shooting an armed rocket into its own foot. If aliens are conspicuous by their absence, it's because they have all become extinct or, at the very least, have slowly regressed. So, since we have already reached the stage where we are capable of sending signals into space, and given the direction in which the deadly cursor seems to point with the most insistence, we would do well to worry a little, to face the greatest enemy of every civilization, the one that comes from within. Currently, it's impossible to determine if the theory of great filters correctly explains the Great Silence, or if these filters are in our past or future. But it is amazing to think that in the future, possible discoveries could help to slightly change the game. Because if we were to discover, for example on Mars, relatively simple and fossilized forms of life, then this would give arguments to the hypotheses that the great filters are behind us. Indeed, this discovery would support scenarios of the type life appears easily elsewhere than on Earth, but countless obstacles then block its path before it can reach complex structures. On the other hand, finding the remains of another advanced civilization would in a sense be the worst discovery in all of human history. Because that would amount to giving credit to the fact that our future is to hit a wall that we ourselves have helped to erect. In which case the Great Filter is nearby, the others are not non-existent or silent, but dead, and the obstacles await us. They are in front of us. From that perspective, rejoice. So far, the night sky remains silent,